Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Tonight's discussion begins with COVID-19's continued deadly march. China seems to be witnessing a second wave, with Beijing reporting 45 new cases. The Shenfadi market in southeastern Beijing was closed Saturday and neighboring residential compounds locked down after more than 50 people in the capital tested positive for the coronavirus. There were the first confirmed cases in 50 days in the city of 20 million people. Is this a second wave, as I said, or new cases illustrate how the virus can come back as anti-disease controls are relaxed? Meanwhile, other unknowns remain. Last week, Maria Van Kerkhove, the WHO's technical lead on the COVID-19 pandemic, walked back an earlier statement that asymptomatic people rarely spread the disease. Do they? Don't they? Apparently, we don't really know. We also don't know the causal pathways, an issue we have discussed in this program a couple of times. Treatment tries to determine the impact on a patient and then intervenes to shore up the body's resistance or reduce the virulence of the virus. Nothing is available as yet to directly attack and kill the pathogen. An Imperial College study, meanwhile, tells us Pakistan could end up with more than 80,000 deaths by the time it reaches the peak in early August. A pretty bleak picture by all counts that also puts paid to early conjectures that opening up won't do much harm. The final question is somewhat simple. How and when do pandemics peter out? We have heard the term herd immunity. Does that mean the virus's virulence after a while reduces? If yes, how does that happen? To answer these questions, we have with us Dr. Ranu Dhillon, who's a global health physician at the Harvard Medical School, as a former special advisor to the president of Guinea on the Ebola response. But before I go to Dr. Dhillon, let me go to Zoon Ahmed Khan, a journalist based in Beijing, to get a ground report from what's happening in Beijing. Zoon.
Yes, Ejaz. Firstly, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, there definitely seems to be a second wave coming to Beijing. And the interesting, or I would say the unfortunate thing about this second wave is that it emerged from a market, which is not only the biggest wholesale food market in Beijing or China, but supposedly in Asia as well. Right now, if I give you certain figures, 70% of Beijing's food supply is linked to the Shenfadi market. So right now, if we look at the numbers, we have 80 active cases. We have about 19,000 people in lockdown, 8,000 people who were linked directly with the market. These are the people who work there, the sellers, the vendors. They have already been tested and they have been sent to quarantine facilities. And a massive effort has already been launched to test people who either visited the market or are living in the Fankai district or the Haidian district where I'm a resident of as well. And obviously, apart from the strict measures to maybe take a few steps back, for instance, a lot of people have been asked to register again with housing societies, avoid going outdoors. Companies have asked their employees to maybe go back to working in their offices for 2 to 3 days a week and working from home otherwise. But secondly, today's press briefing also focused on the food security measures that Beijing has taken, which have also been immense and important for the situation that's evolving.
Zoon, let me ask you, what in God's name is wrong with these markets in China? I mean, last time we heard when it began, there was a market involved. Earlier also, there's been a lot of criticism of these markets, especially the exotic animals that are sold there. I'm not sure if that was the case here with the Shenfadi market, but there's some kind of, causality here or a correlation. I mean, what exactly is that?
I sort of saw this question coming, and this is a very important question. The thing is that particularly this time, the virus came from, they did genetic testing. So far, it's plausible that it was salmon that was infected. But really, the testing showed that the source of this virus is Northern Europe. So I'm not saying that it justifies a certain perception about wet markets, that there's nothing wrong with food being supplied. And these markets can become the source of not just COVID, but many other diseases as well. But in particular, here we see that the source is Northern Europe. And at the end of the day, the real question is that as long as our food supplies as long as we are connected with other countries and the situation globally is not improving, really, no matter if you're in China or any other part of the world, we are not really safe. So this is a deeper question to understand, I guess. Here, the source clearly was from outside of China.
Absolutely. There are lots of deeper questions. And that's why we have Dr. Dhillon with us. Thank you so much. That was Zoon Ahmed Khan speaking with us from Beijing. Let's go to Dr. Dhillon for the technicalities involved in all of this. Dr. Dhillon, is this a second wave? Let's begin with that. But there are other questions also, but let's begin with the second wave issue. Is this a second wave, or is this about, the virus being there and the moment you relax, the lockdowns, that it reemerges?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's actually most helpful not to even think about epidemics in waves, because especially when you have an epidemic that's happening at a global level like this is, in some places your first wave, some places it'll be the second wave, but all places are interconnected. And so even if one place has passed its first wave, a second wave could be receded by transmission that's happening in another country that's part of their first wave. I think what we're going to see until we have a vaccine or some other strategies to end the epidemic, to end the pandemic at a global level, is you're going to see various sorts of waves and ripples, and you're going to have progress, then you're going to have setbacks. That's the nature of all epidemics, and especially one that's happening across the world. The chance for things to recede in countries that have made progress is going to always be there. And so I think whether it's first, second, it depends on the country. What's most important is what are the next steps that need to be taken to try to bring it under control.
Okay, but Dr. Dhillon, we've done multiple programs on this, and one of the impressions that I come away with is that even the top experts are still looking at, some aspects of this are by now known. Then there are known unknowns and a number of unknown unknowns, to quote Donald Rumsfeld's, positing of the unknown unknowns thing. Now, here's the thing. When we talk about the 1918 pandemic, that was wrongly called the Spanish flu, but generally known as that, there was a sense that the deadly march ended after the virus's virulence somehow became less. Now, if that is correct, how exactly does that happen? And is that likely to happen at this point also? I will come back to the vaccine issue, but let's first get this out of the way.
To suggest that this epidemic or even the Spanish flu particularly waned out because the virus necessarily got less virulent. There's a lot of mystery to how flu pandemics work. And so it is true that sometimes you see cases surging and then all of a sudden it disappears. And even your specialists on influenza are still wrestling with why that happens. The suggestion, though, right now, from everything we know about COVID, is we wouldn't expect that its virulence to wane and that to be the end point for this. We might see cases decline with certain seasonality, but ultimately it's going to be a matter of getting immunity to a certain point in the population through either widespread infection and or vaccine. The second strategy, though, could be something along the lines of what New Zealand has been able to accomplish, which is some measure of control. And I don't think any place in the world should give up on the idea that control can be achieved. I think it's a matter of figuring out how to do that.
But, when it comes to population density, it becomes, more difficult. I mean, New Zealand obviously is a population of 3 million people and 60 million sheep. So I'm not saying that the more densely populated countries, I mean, Vietnam has been able to do something, that Dharavi in Mumbai seems to be a good case to study. But density obviously makes it difficult, and also various cultural and social issues and how people behave. But let me get to the issue of vaccine. Now, on the issue of vaccine, I've been speaking with experts, and apparently there are 7 that are approved by the WHO at this point in time. They are going to go through the clinical trials. Then, of course, and that's the process. And then, of course, the issue of commercial manufacture of those and distribution and the rest of it. So it's going to be a long process. Some people say about 18 months to 24 months. Others say that it could be, beyond that, and some even say that we're not really sure that the vaccine will actually work in more than 40% cases. So once again, we are into the realm of unknown unknowns.
That's correct. So vaccine is actually never a guarantee. There's viruses for which, for example, HIV, for which there is still not a vaccine. And so certainly if there's going to be a vaccine, it's going to be on the fastest on the horizon of, I think, around 18 months or so. Now, with that said, vaccine is not the only step we can take right now. You mentioned the challenge of density. And what we've learned about this virus is that it spreads when people are in cramped and crowded quarters, when people are indoors, when people are frequently in contact with other people other than the people that perhaps they live with and are around anyway. That's how you have transmission happen. So there's certain measures, there's only so much you can do to address that, especially in certain settings. I do think there are a lot of other opportunities to try to prevent transmission. For example, coming up with more effective masks that the general population could wear. You know, the masks that are being used now certainly will help in some manner to at least prevent someone who is infected from maybe expelling as much infectious particles into the air. Now, if you actually had masks that also protected wearers more effectively, you could start diminishing transmission. What we've understood about this virus is that primarily this is something that spreads through the air. And I think if we can figure out ways to mitigate that spread, we don't have to eliminate 100% of transmission, just enough to start bringing the reproduction rate, how much the virus propagates forward, down, and over time it will start diminishing on its own.
Absolutely, and I believe some studies show that you need a certain amount of it, and then you need to be exposed for a certain period of time. But stay with me, Dr. Dhillon. I'm also joined by Dr. Alina Ahmed Khan, who's a medical officer at a COVID emergency room. Dr. Khan, thank you for being with us. We're talking about the fact that there's so much that's not known, and primarily what we are trying to do here is when someone comes in to see what the pathway is in terms of how this virus is impacting him or her, and then shore up the defenses, body's defenses, with antibiotics and with vitamins and the rest of it, and then see how the body reacts to that. Have I got that right?
It's interesting how this virus is affecting people in different ways. There's not a particular set of symptoms that everyone is having at the moment. Some people have some GIT symptoms, so somebody would have cough or shortness of breath. Some people are asymptomatic. This virus is pretty interesting as of yet.
So it's one of the, I was talking to Dhillon about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and I've had multiple experts on my previous programs with reference to this. There's also a lot of confusion about the pathways. Initially, it was about fever. Then the US Medical Journal came up and said that at least 70% of the patients that were admitted did not have fever. Initially, it was thought that it only attacks the respiratory system, but then there were cases of thrombosis, there were issues of kidney, there were various other issues. And of course, a lot of comorbidities also play their role in this. But since you're dealing with these patients, what is the general sort of pathway that you're witnessing in the patients that you're treating?
So in my 3 months of working in the COVID ER, I've seen people as young as 6 years to as old as a 100-year-old coming in with symptoms or without symptoms. And I've also seen people being really healthy yet falling really sick. But I've seen people who are 90 years old and are symptomless, even though they have diabetes or hypertension. That's why there is so much variety and such different strains affecting all of us. But on an average, I would say it's usually people in the age bracket of 40 to 70, 80 that are getting more affected. And they actually occupy the most beds in the hospital.
Not exactly good news for one in that age bracket, which also includes me. But can you sort of, talk a little bit about the government's strategy? I believe in Lahore, where both of us live, there's now some smart lockdowns because apparently the surge has caused a lot of load on the hospitals and beds and ventilators. Is that correct?
Yes, but unfortunately, I feel like we're falling short on numbers. It's really heartbreaking that people from other cities are coming to Lahore looking for ventilators or beds or rooms so that they can isolate themselves. Because I believe, as far as I've seen, we're really short on all these facilities.
Okay,
I know. Yeah.
Dr. Khan, stay with me. I'll return to you with another question, but let me pull in Dr. Dhillon here. Dr. Dhillon, one of the things about the hammer and the smart dance, the lockdown and then, smart opening up, one of the major arguments was that you try and contain it to a point where it does not begin to overwhelm the healthcare systems. Now, when we, and most countries have tried to do that, some have done it more efficiently, others have kind of, bumbled through it, but managed it somehow. But let's take a look at Sweden, for instance. I mean, despite a lot of criticism, Sweden has stuck to its guns. And they've actually been pretty stressed by the fact that the Nordic countries have put a ban on Swedes traveling within the region. Give me your sense of how you look at what Sweden has done and whether that is something which is sustainable.
Yeah, so I think what we've learned from the Sweden example is that trying to go on without some sort of interventions, some sort of, I agree, population-wide lockdowns are very difficult to sustain, but some degree of targeted lockdown or having certain social distancing measures in place. Without doing that, you're going to have rampant spread, which is what Sweden has had. Now, if you look at the hospitalization and death rates, especially the death rates, Sweden's numbers are far beyond any country in its region and even compares badly at a global level. And in fact, the Swedish epidemiologist for the government has come out and said that they wish they would have acted differently. So that shows us that that approach is limited. And, if Sweden's a country that's doing this where a lot of the population actually lives either one or two people living alone in a household, which is very different than many other countries. So Sweden's a country where doing something like that could have potentially worked better than other places where transmission is going to be more likely to happen. And so I think what we learned from the Swedish example is letting the virus run rampant doesn't preclude a toll on the population in terms of deaths. At the same time, the population level immunity that Sweden has gotten out of doing that is actually minimal. So it doesn't get you meaningfully closer to that, what we call herd immunity threshold, where the virus may stop propagating. So you kind of lose on both fronts. So the challenge is that you don't have...
Dr. Dhillon, let me interject since I am running out of time. So this also becomes a moral hazard issue when we talk about herd immunity because, frankly, this is essentially a euphemism for saying, well, this is going to have its deadly march. It's going to go through the population and somehow we have to basically live with the fact that X numbers will be claimed by the pathogen. But then, as I said, it also becomes a moral hazard question. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't necessarily agree that it has to play that way because actually if you let it play that way, it will actually collapse your public health system. And collapsing the public health system is also going to then have economic consequences also. So I think it's very difficult to allow it to play that way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Ranu Dhillon, speaking with us. Finally, let me go back to Dr. Khan here. Dr. Khan, we can't really let it play like this in the sense that, herd immunity being reached in a way where there are no lockdowns, you allow it to spread, the spikes, surges, all of that. The healthcare system begins to collapse, and then it becomes completely unmanageable. So as a physician, what would your approach be and what kind of message would you like to give to people in terms of the precautions that they need to take?
I would just strongly suggest to be really careful when it comes to social distancing, wearing a mask, making sure you sanitize everything. There are so many different strains out there. It doesn't guarantee that if you have gotten it once or if you're immune to one strain, you will be immune towards all the other strains that are out there. It also poses a risk when it comes to the elderly, your grandparents, your parents, people you meet on a daily basis. Large events like weddings happening. We know this very closely because we've been seeing this every day. It's so heartbreaking to see a family member passing away due to something that was so preventable. It was not something you were born with or you got it because of your disease or something. It was something that you got because you weren't careful enough or people around you weren't careful enough. It's going to be a long run. This is going to stay here. There is no vaccine coming out in the next couple of months, and you can't just rely on that and infect as many people as you please.
Absolutely.
I believe people just need to stay home and be careful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And stay safe because you're on the front lines of this. That was Dr. Alina Ahmed Khan speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the visit of Iran's foreign minister to Turkey and relations between those two countries. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. The next item on tonight's menu is the visit of Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif to Turkey. Zarif arrived in Ankara Sunday evening. At an initial press meet, he said that relations with our neighbors are a priority for Iran. He also said that he will be discussing economic relations and energy cooperation with Turkey, among other bilateral matters. The bilateral matters seems to be a euphemism for major policy and objective divergences between Tehran and Ankara in Syria, especially in northern Syria. The visit comes in the wake of recent escalation in Idlib and the violation of the ceasefire agreement reached between Turkey and Russia on 5th March. In fact, diplomatic sources had earlier announced that Zarif's visit to Istanbul would coincide with the visit of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who would also be due in Turkey on Sunday for talks. That visit, however, got postponed. To get the inside view of what was discussed between Zarif and his Turkish counterpart, Mevlut Cavusoglu, we have with us Mohammad Marandi, who is an academic, political analyst, joins us from Tehran. We also have with us Onur Evrim, who is President at Dragoman Strategies, a think tank in Ankara, and joins us from Istanbul. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Evrim here. Mr. Evrim, I have some of the bullet points of the joint presser. There is a lot of talk about solidarity and, of course, good neighborly relations. All of that was expected. But as I said in my opening, there are strong divergences in Syria. And I would like you to focus on those and inform our viewers what your reading of the situation is.
Well, it's not a hidden fact that the Turkish and Iranian positions are differing in Syria, in northern Iraq, mainly over the PKK terrorist organization or the approach to it. As the foreign minister of Iran has stated, I think Turkey and Iran will continue to even harder now explore, deeper relationships by being neighbors, especially as the foreign minister stated after the realization of what a neighbor should be after the corona pandemic in the recent months. As I said, listening to him and listening to Mevlut Cavusoglu, there was some sense of, newly found, positive messaging between the two countries. Will this carry out on the land? Will this carry out on the actual differences of what's really departing the two countries for difference of opinion? We will see. But obviously, there were a lot of issues. The main reason that they came together was to sign an accord, really in regards to diplomatic real estate between the two countries and the problem and solving that problem in particular. But, coming together, both foreign ministers, of course, I'm sure there was some extensive talk about Syria, about Libya, even about Eastern Mediterranean hydrocarbon searches, and probably with the last attack on PKK over the northern Iraq last night, literally, they were all on the table being talked about. But it seems that there is some newly found positive sense between the two countries, at least as it reflects to media.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let me go to Mr. Marandi. Mr. Marandi, what's your take of the meeting and the joint presser?
Well, I agree that Syria was an important topic, as you pointed out at the beginning, but I think that the problems that exist with the bilateral relationship, partially due to the coronavirus, was probably the key issue. Both countries are facing major economic challenges, Turkey in particular after the virus, and Iran because of the sanctions, and to a degree because of the virus. These challenges are hurting the economy. The borders have been closed, and this has hurt both Turkish and Iranian businesses. So the two countries, the two sides are looking for solutions to be able to reopen their economies and link up the two economies with one another without aggravating the health situation with regards to the coronavirus. I also think, though, of course, that Syria will be discussed. The Iranians are looking into possibilities of some sort of rapprochement between Ankara and Damascus, even though that's not something that will happen anytime soon, but even small steps in that direction, the Iranians will believe will lessen the difficulties, especially with regards to the refugees. Okay. Both Iran and Turkey have a great deal of interest in preserving the territorial integrity of both Iraq and Syria.
It's interesting you've said, so let me posit a hypothesis. Now, obviously, as far as Iran is concerned, or for that matter, Moscow is concerned, Bashar al-Assad and his government are kind of non-negotiable. But in terms of a rapprochement that you're mentioning, would there be a possibility of, for instance, meeting Turkey's immediate demand of creating a buffer zone and also its demands with reference to the Kurdish fighters and groups?
I think that the Iranians would not be prepared to speak on behalf of the Syrian government. But the position that the Syrian government has is that the only real solution is for full sovereignty to be restored in the whole of Syria, and then will the extremist groups that exist in those areas, including PKK affiliates, will they be removed, and will there be a responsible body to ensure that they are removed? I think there have been indications of change between Ankara and Damascus. We do know that there have been both indirect, but more importantly, direct negotiations between the two sides at very particular levels. I'm not optimistic that there's going to be any significant rapprochement, but if the two sides can be pushed towards one another to a degree, some of the issues can be resolved, and the issue of refugees is probably the most important of them all.
Okay, let me take this to Mr. Erim. Mr. Erim, what is your response, I should say, to what Mr. Marandi has said with reference to the possibilities? You know, there are lots of convergence points, as we, as the two foreign ministers mentioned at the presser also. But I'm focusing on the divergences because I want to find out if there is a possibility of these convergences actually working positively towards finding some kind of, a modus vivendi as far as the divergences are concerned.
I don't think Turkey would even try to consider a solution where the first thing to do is to make sure that there is a safe and humane environment for more than the 3.5, actually 4 million now, I guess, Syrian refugees who are being taken care of by the government of Turkey for the last 8 years. So whatever solution you're going to come up with, you have to make sure that this issue is addressed first and foremost and decisively. Unfortunately,
sorry, I'm interjecting. So basically, that's what Mr. Marandi was also saying. So you're in agreement with him on that.
But not the way Bashar Assad has put forward in the last couple of months ago. I guess it was last, that where he would call all of them to Syria with no security. I mean, nobody would flee their land, nobody would flee their home unless they were threatened by their lives or by their families' lives, and or at least having a humane plateau for living as a human being. So the reason that these Syrian refugees in Turkey especially are not going back is because for them going back means death, because that's what Bashar Assad will do. He has killed his own civilian people in hundreds of thousands, and nobody is trusting Assad, not his own people, and I don't blame them. I would be in the same position, not wanting to go back to my own home if I was put in that situation. So first and foremost, the international community has to find a way, whether this is a solution that Turkey is trying to do on her own now, or whether it's another solution, is a safe and sound place for the people of Syria to go back to their own homes. That's that. I mean, unfortunately, everybody that puts a hand on the Syrian issue or the Syrian refugee issue is not a neighbor of Syria. Turkey is. So it's very easy for others to talk about such matters where it doesn't hurt them at all. Maybe to some degree Europe, but they have a nice buffer between that area, that region, that entire region, and Europe, which we usually call Asia Minor or popularly called Turkey. So we're the only ones that are getting hit by dictators like Bashar Assad and their atrocities. So that's got to stop. Turkey has been taking care of the Syrian refugees for the past almost 9 years now.
Okay, I get the gist. This. I get the gist of what Mr. Aram. Syed Mohammad Marandi, it doesn't seem like this is an easy picking. I thought when the two of you talked about this that I thought that perhaps there could be a common ground, but it seems that this issue is far too complicated.
Yes, it is very difficult. I've been to both Damascus many times, and I've been to Istanbul and Ankara quite often. And the language on both sides is very similar, yet the names are reversed. And that's why I have no great expectations. Damascus, and when I go to Damascus University or I speak to students or colleagues, I hear the same thing that I'm hearing in Istanbul or Ankara, but again, it's the accusations are in the opposite direction. And that's why I think that this is not going to, real rapprochement is not going to be brought about anytime soon. However, at a realistic level, both Ankara and Damascus recognize that the issues, the longer it takes for some of these issues to be resolved, the more detrimental it will be to both countries, especially at a time when the globe is entering what is possibly a Great Depression. And the economic situation in Turkey will deteriorate rapidly, as it will everywhere else in the world. The sanctions in Syria will make the situation much more difficult. This is a problem that many people are envisaging is going to hit the world quite fast, and because except for what we're hearing in the mainstream Western media about a V-shape or a U-shape rebound in the economy, most serious economists are saying that the situation is going to get extremely difficult, and it's going to be a very long-term problem. So the only solution is basically to nudge the two sides slowly towards one another and allow them to attack each other verbally as much as they like, but to have some small steps taken to ease tensions.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Syed Mohammad Marandi speaking with us. Let me go back to Mr. Arim here. Mr. Arim, from the Syrian side, the argument is that regional players are interfering in Syria's territory, and that undermines Syria's sovereignty. Of course, the opponents of that argument say that Bashar al-Assad simply does not have the local stand-eye to be there because he began killing dissidents, and that led to a civil war. So how does one, but you know, as you rightly pointed out, the brunt of this has been taken by millions of Syrian civilians. And so they're the ones who have suffered the most. So how does one think about ways of getting to a point where at least their plight can be reduced, where they can go back to their homes, where things can begin to look better?
I guess the simple answer is Assad's stepping down from his dictatorship would be a very simple answer. But as we know from past experience, that's not always the best solution, at least for this region. You have to understand something. Assad only represents about maybe 1/5, maybe 1/4 at best of Syrians. The rest of Syria has either fled from him or is opposing him. The only reason that he's now sitting as the officially recognized head of the government is because, probably largely due to Russia and maybe to some degree of Iran's support. Other than that, Bashar al-Assad does not have the support of his people. These are very, these are not polls, these are not election results. These are, just right there. Just think of the number of people that lived in Syria. Think of those who are opposing him. Just tally those up. Tally up the ones that have fled the country. And you get about maybe 15 to 20% of Syrians that is still supporting. That's in a quote. They're supporting him under his Iron Fist rule within or in there around the area of Damascus. So it's first of all a question is how much his dictatorship, how much his leadership is actually valid, and without Russia, without the support of Russia, and obviously to some degree of Iran, whether he would be able to spend even a minute on his post.
Okay,
one of the biggest problems.
Yeah, Mr. Arim, let's take to Dr. Kamran Gasanov, who's a senior lecturer at People's Friendship University of Russia. Dr. Gasanov, Bashar al-Assad would not be where he is but for Russia's support and also Iran's support. Now, that doesn't say much about Bashar al-Assad's popularity and the argument that Bashar al-Assad represents the sovereign formal Syrian government.
Actually, in recent time, we can see that Russia's position is slightly changed because we have now different circumstance in Syria. The war is not possible because what Assad could achieve, he already have achieved. First of all, Idlib, where Turkish troops are present, and East Euphrates, where we have the United States and British forces. It's also impossible to gain this territory without a major war. And Russia tries to convince Assad to go to political concessions to start really political process. But I wouldn't say that Russia supports pure Assad. Russia still supports because without Assad, Russia has no power in Syria because they're fully linked with each other, and for the future of Syria, for retaining the unity of Syria, it's important to start real political process, and I think that Russian diplomacy tries to convince Assad.
Okay, Mr. Aram, so that's what Russia is telling Bashar al-Assad now, to start a political process. But someone who's prepared to kill thousands of people but not step down would want one presupposition, which is that he remains the central point of the political process. Now, if my assumption is correct, then the political process is defeated even before it begins.
Pretty much so. I mean, how would you be able to justify to the people of Syria trying to put some validity by mainly the international powers or the international world, where they're offering you as Syrians a possibility of electing a leader, a dictator, who has killed maybe his cousin, maybe his family, maybe his wife, daughter, son, whatever. Yes, you're right. I mean, presenting him as a valid choice in a possible free election would also pretty much undermine the history and what the Syrian people think of Assad to begin with. Would it be some sort of a mental defeat for Syrians before it even hits the ballots? Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that.
Okay, so let me, before I close this segment, go back to Dr. Gasanov. So, Dr. Gasanov, going by this, the issue of political process, unfortunately, is pretty complicated. It's not as easy as it sounds.
Yes, political process is difficult to start when you have still war, you have still fightings. Even after Russia-Turkey deal in Idlib, we have still fighting, still ceasefire violation. We should stop these key countries. I mean, the United States, Russia, Turkey should have a deal that all violations, all fightings should stop. And afterwards, I think the unique possibility is to have representatives from East Euphrates, from Idlib and the main and the rest of Syria, who will define the future of the country. But the problem is that people who participated in war, they have no legitimacy for the population of Syria. This should be new people, new politicians, maybe from among the young people who have no association, no imagination with war, and they would be like
that would be an ideal situation. But I don't think that's going to happen. But thank you so much, Honor Aram, Dr. Kamran Gasanov, for speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We should see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at Indus.news. Good night and goodbye.